From this UNESCO World Heritage Site here in historic Bridgetown, I'm Sherwood McCaskey welcoming you to Our Heritage. It is your television program that calls attention to our celebrated history and heritage. Today, Professor Henry Fraser and Dr. Carl Watson will conduct a walk-in tour of some of the sites to be found here in Greater Bridgetown. Both gentlemen played a fundamental role in securing Barbados's inscription on the prestigious UNESCO World Heritage List. Professor Fraser has written a number of books and several articles over the years. We cannot forget Treasures of Barbados, which was eventually turned into a television series.
Likewise, the original mace was a lethal weapon. If anyone resisted the authority of the King's Sergeant-at-Arms, he would reverse the mace and knock the knave down, using the big end that was built to bash brains in.
Dr. Watson has also written a number of books and articles. He has lectured many history courses, both at the Mona campus and the Cave Hill campus of the University of the West Indies. At Cave Hill, he has been the coordinator of the Masters of Arts degree program in Heritage Studies.
Barbados, as a sugar producing colony, became very wealthy, very strong, with a strong local militia. Garrison improved, and then most of these buildings here date from the late 18th, early 19th century.
Both gentlemen are eminently qualified to conduct this tour of some of the sites of historic Bridgetown that are listed in the dossier, that is, the intellectual support that resulted in the inscription of Greater Bridgetown and its garrison on that UNESCO World Heritage List. We begin right here in Jubilee Garden, an area that has been transformed on numerous occasions. As you would learn, and there are many stories to be told about Jubilee Garden.
So there's an awful lot about Jubilee Gardens. Somebody said to me, but where is Jubilee Gardens? And that worried me a little bit, but it's just that some of us get older and a little bit more forgetful. And if I forget things, I know that Sherwood will remind me, because he is 30 years younger and has all of these facts at his fingertips. Okay, Jubilee Gardens used to be the butcher's market, or what they call the butcher's shambles. Now, a lot of old British cities have got shambles in them. Anybody been to York? If you've been to York, then you've been to the shambles in York. It was usually the place where a very crowded, ancient center of the city. This was the butcher's market, and all kinds of other things took place there.
Well, this is where the slave market of Bridgetown was. Well, not the slave market where slaves were bought and sold. This was the slave market where slaves brought goods, and they sold their goods. This is the point of commerce for the enslaved people, not only Bridgetown, but of the country, who grew a little ginger, who grew perhaps a little tobacco, who had 3 fowls and maybe brought eggs down the town to sell, who had a sheep or a goat and brought down milk, a cow. Whatever slaves could do to earn independent income, they did. So we have actually excavated the area where the slave market was and recovered some fascinating artifacts, and it's been reported on.
And if you want to see what it was really, imagine what it was really like 300 years ago, then go over there, where on the edge of the grassy patch there is what looks a little bit like a tombstone.
I would invite everybody to come and have a look, especially Mr. Lane. I know I'm doing this. This is a parable. There is a lesson to be learned from this. What do you all see down here? What do you all see? Somebody said cobblestone, somebody said a duppy.
It is not a tombstone. It is actually a framed construction showing you the brick street of the shambles 3 feet below the level of the current square. That is how much dirt accumulated over 300 years. the level of this area has risen by more than 3 feet. And that original brick paving was the brick paving of the square when this was the butcher's market.
Yes, what you all see is a cobblestone road. This is one of the first roads laid out in Bridgetown. This is one of the oldest roads in Bridgetown. This was revealed when we did an archaeological excavation here. We were going to backfill, but then I thought it would be useful to show the people of Bridgetown and visitors what our old roads look like. This road was probably built in 1630 when Bridgetown was developed. So the BDI built this construction around it and covered it with plexiglass and their lights at night so that people can come and look. And it's like looking at a time machine. But what does it lack? What does it need? Right, somebody said a sign. There's no signage. Yeah, you've never seen it before?
No, I didn't know it was something.
And a lot of people see it and have no idea what it is. So we have spent this money for this, which is very good, and I'm glad they took my suggestion. But then they asked me to write the inscription explaining what it was. So I wrote the sign for here. Well, that was over 5 years ago, when not Mr. Lane, but somebody else was there, and it was on a different dispensation. And I kept asking, where's the sign, where's the sign? But no sign. And that's what Bridgetown lacks, signage.
Evidently, in order for you to understand a heritage site, there must be some form of interpretation. As pointed out by Dr. Carl Watson, it is not sufficient to mount the display merely. If it is to have meaning and absolute relevance to the people, there must be signage and interpretation. Well, from the Jubilee Garden and its lack of proper signage, we move now to the James Fort.
Another big change in this area, of course, is James Fort. And on the site of the James Fort Mall was a fort on the edge of the sea.
Bridgetown was protected by a series of forts. And in fact, these warehouses are built on the ramparts of James Fort. In fact, when they were doing restorations for the building, I actually came down here and did some archaeology. And the whole fort is still there. Beautiful fort, lovely ramparts, everything, steps. But the warehouses are built on top of it. And in the restoration, I'd suggested to the owners that in the area where there are beautiful steps going down, that I put like a perspex glass in the floor and people could go and look back, and it's like looking in a time machine. But I said no, it would cost too much money, so they poured concrete on everything. So it's all there, all filled in.
So just imagine that the sea was right there, just 100 yards away from us, and instead now we have another 200 yards beyond that of car park and heliport.
But James Fort was where the young George Washington, when he was a youngster, he came here and he saw for the first time in his life fireworks from James Fort, because this is all filled in. The sea used to come right up to the side of the fort. And going down, half the building is still there, or a quarter, and it has potential. That was one of the biggest theatres in Bridgetown in the 19th century, called Marshall's Hall. It was disused, abandoned, and part of it burned some 20 years ago. The rest is still there and awaiting some good restoration. There was a move afoot to demolish it, but the National Trust complained, and so the owners decided to retain it, awaiting some use of it, some method of incorporating it into the landscape, streetscape of Bridgetown.
Now, although they stand here seemingly as mere stone structures for some, there is an intrinsic beauty that lies in each of them, and that beauty in a sense harmonizes well to form a beautiful streetscape right here on Hinks Street.
You see how nice when you color coordinate, how attractive buildings can be? See? This street has been color coordinated. And how nice it would be if the remnant of Marshall Hall was incorporated into this streetscape.
Hopefully all will not be lost. The importance of harmonizing with the other buildings here might very well become the reality of the Marshall Hall. Professor Fraser continues now with some of the other changes that have occurred in this area of Bridgetown.
So Bridgetown has changed in many ways, and we are really actually sitting just a few feet above the water, which is something we'll come back to when we get over to the synagogue. So the shambles over there, on this side we have that beautiful, partially correctly restored building, which was the old vestry hall. Now you will see somewhere on the building a sign that says the Old Town Hall. That is an error, and I apologize, it's my fault, because when I did the Treasures of Barbados videos, I loosely used the term the Old Town Hall. It was the old vestry hall. The Old Town Hall is the Supreme Court building on Coleridge Street. This was the vestry hall, and it was constructed when the vestry decided they wanted a grand space. It was constructed of several buildings with a facade that was balconied in Victorian style around the building itself. But there were at least 4 houses that went into that construction, which from this side, from the east and the north, looks like a single building. It was in fact a facade around 4 buildings. Much of it has been destroyed in the reconstruction, but there was a 3-storied house with a very lovely mahogany staircase at the center in the old days. When you went there to pay your land tax and so on, if you had gone behind where the counters were, you would have seen this lovely hallway that went up 3 stories with a nice mahogany staircase. That's gone. The recent history of that building, of course, was it became, instead of the vestry hall for the parish of St. Michael, it became the city hall when Bridgetown was incorporated between 1958, when the local government organization, or BALGO, was created, until 1967, when the government of the late national hero, Mr. Barrow, abolished local government. So from 58 to 67, it was transformed from the vestry hall to the city hall. It was never really the town hall. Anyway, it's been beautifully restored on this side, although if you go to the other side, you think you're dealing with a completely different building, because the other side is a completely modern facade. And then if you keep going around now to the east, you've got, or the northeast really, the north and the east, you've got St. Mary's Church. And this is known for many years as the Old Churchyard, because this was the second church site in Barbados after Old Town, established in 1628, and in the middle of the in the early part of the 18th century, they decided they needed a much bigger church. So they decided to build the new St. Michael's Church further over to the east. And they literally abandoned this church. I'm not clear what happened to the materials, but you know what happens in Barbados? If a building is disused for more than 5 years, then people move in and they start taking away the fittings. First go the windows, nowadays the lavatory fittings, and then the beams, everything that's wood, and eventually the stones go. So over a period of 10 or 20 years, the abandoned buildings in Barbados quietly disappear as if they have been sort of dissolved into the ground again. And so by 1800s, this was then just known as the Old Churchyard with the old tombstones and no building. And it was decided to rebuild it in the early 1820s. When Bishop Coleridge arrived in Barbados, he discovered that these plans had been afoot for some time, and they hadn't got around to doing anything about it. And he was a very energetic man, loved churches, and he brought neo-Gothic style into Barbados. So the church had actually been designed in the then popular Georgian style. Now think about the Gothic churches of Barbados. Think about St. John's Church. Think even about much of the cathedral building, but think about many of the older historic churches of Barbados, and you see Gothic. You see lancet windows, pointed windows. You see trefoil windows, intricately shaped little windows. You see castellations, towers with castellations. This is Gothic style, neo-Gothic style. But in 1825, when Bishop Coleridge arrived, everything in Britain was being built in the new style of Georgian. And Georgian meant arched windows and arched doors and Palladian symmetry. So this church is entirely Georgian with arched windows and coins around it and so on, all very symmetrical. And suddenly you have a castellated tower. And that's a kind of concession to Bishop Coleridge, who insisted the church have a tower. And we saw the same thing happening in St. George's Parish Church, because St. George's Parish Church is one that survived the 1831 hurricane. It was built in 1784 after the destruction of the 1780 hurricane, so it was built at the height of the Georgian period in the reign of George III. Therefore, St. George's Church is a Georgian building. And the Reverend Leonard Malaloo in the 1950s said, "My parishioners want a tower. They feel deficient. They feel neglected. There's no great erection at the front of the church, and they feel somehow that this isn't right." So I remember as a small boy, the Reverend Malaloo had a whole series of fairs and a big fundraising campaign, which I'll come back to at the end, to raise the money to build a church tower. So you see St. George's Church looks like St. Mary's, a Georgian building with a Gothic tower. So there's St. Mary's Church, rebuilt under Bishop Coleridge in 1825-26. He laid the cornerstone within months of his arrival here. He just got things moving. What we could do with a man like Bishop Coleridge to save the cathedral, huh? Get things moving. In St. Mary's Church, is there anybody here who has not been into St. Mary's Church? No one. Fantastic. So everybody knows the beauty of St. Mary's. It is the second most beautiful church in Barbados, or the third most beautiful. The most beautiful is St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Cathedral. There's no question about that. But St. Mary's has the most beautiful ceiling. And the Georgian symmetry, the whole interior design is extremely harmonious and very lovely.
Well, if you are in a burial ground with Professor Henry Fraser and Dr. Carl Watson, rest assured you will be told a number of vaulted stories from the vault, or, nicely put, some tales from the tombs.
I just thought we'd pause here by the tomb of the first mayor of the city of Bridgetown, Ernest Dighton Motley, and most people know about the history of the Motley family and the famous Mr. E.D. Motley, known as the City Father. He was the elected MP for the parish. He was the vestryman who did a great deal of, you know, for the poor of the parish of St. Michael. So he was obviously an important person, and his wife here.
See this grey mausoleum? That was the mausoleum of a very important free-coloured family in Barbados, a family called Barclay. Even before the American Civil War that settled the issue of slavery in the United States of America, there were questions of the establishment of a homeland in West Africa and the repatriation of those people of African descent who wanted to go back to Africa. So the country called Liberia, from the Latin freedom, Liberia, country celebrating freedom, was formed. Well, what does that have to do with the Barclays? It has a lot to do with the Barclays. The Barclays who are buried in there, their children, one of them married the daughter of London born. They migrated to Liberia. A lot of people do not know, but a number of powerful free-coloured individuals financed emigration groups so that from the 1850s, 1860s, Barbadians who wanted to could migrate and create a new life for themselves in Liberia. The Barclays were elites. They were the powerful, high-brown, coloured elites of Barbados. So their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, even down to today, that family that's buried in there have produced presidents of Liberia, chief justices of Liberia, educators of Liberia. And so, in small Barbados, that tomb reflects the success of the venture of Liberia. Again, not many people are aware of this connection.
Well, these programs, Our Heritage, seek to call attention to the many unknown nuggets of truth that make our island such a unique place. In so doing, it strives to educate, inform, and at times entertain. Speaking about the unknown, how many of us are aware of the work of Amaryllis Collymore?
As you walk past, look at this oblong monument that's here lying in the ground. That celebrates a woman, Amaryllis Collymore. Amaryllis Collymore was actually the richest black woman of Barbados of her time. She was richer even than Rachel Pringle Palgrave. And she owned many properties, houses throughout Bridgetown, etc. And this is her gravestone. For many years it was hidden in bush, etc. I always used to come, I knew where it was, and I suggested to the church authorities that they reposition it, and I'm glad to see that they've done so, so that people can come and look at it.
This is the tomb of the first Member of Parliament of the new constituency of the city of Bridgetown 170 years ago. Who is he? National hero. Who is he? Samuel Jackman Prescott. So I thought this is one of our national heroes whose tomb is very important to us, and I thought it was really nice that if people could come and have a look at this beautiful and famous tomb. It's actually a very nicely designed tomb, and it's an unusually attractive piece of sculpture, of masonry, sacred to the memory of Samuel Jackman Prescott, who died at his residence Belfield on the 26th of September, Anno Domini 1871, in the midst of his bereaved family. He does have some descendants still with us in Barbados today, and Jacqueline Banfield is his, I think, great-granddaughter. You know Jacqueline Banfield, the teacher? And his residence at Belfield, anybody know where that is? Belfield? Blank Rock, absolutely. It's now known as the Nightingale Children's Home. That was in fact his residence.
Where we're standing now was actually part of the churchyard, the graveyard. And graves were moved. In fact, my uncle, who was a contractor, Cameron Edwards, when he was working here, they uncovered a lead coffin, and it had the date 1732 written on it. Now in the old days, if you died in the morning, you were buried by afternoon. You had to be buried very quickly, because in this heat, your body started to decompose very quickly. So if you were wealthy enough, you were buried in a lead coffin. And if it was sealed correctly, that acted as a vacuum, and it preserved your body. So when the workman shifted the coffin, it was whole, and I asked him if they could open it up. And he said yes. And when I opened it up, they looked down inside and all screamed, as I did on the pyramid, all screamed and ran. And my uncle came and looked very quickly, and there, he said, looking like she was buried yesterday, there was a white woman with blonde hair. She probably had on a wig, and her arms were crossed, and she had a crucifix, and she had rouge on her cheeks, and everything. Although she'd been buried there for almost 300 years, she was perfectly preserved. And that's because she was buried in a vacuum. All her clothes, beautiful clothes were on her, everything. And they dug a hole and put her down in it. So I suppose by now nothing remains of that. Other places and lead coffins have been found in Barbados, and the people buried in them have been found intact. And if you want to hear more about lead coffins, tune in to Sherwood's Tales from the Tombs programs. You'll learn all about them, especially when the Christchurch segment comes up, and we learn about the moving coffins in Christchurch.
Clearly, the inscriptions on tombstones, when interpreted, provide background information for fascinating analyses of societies. And so we leave behind the many stories from the vault and go to Broad Street, Cheapside, and its beautiful streetscape.
Broad Street used to be called Cheapside, as I'm sure everybody knows. And then they gave it the far more appropriate name of Broad Street because it is so broad. But this is Cheapside, and it's worthwhile looking at that street architecture, because it is one of the few remaining bits of Barbados where there is a streetscape of 5 or 6 buildings which are essentially Victorian or pre-Victorian 19th century buildings. The one at the corner, of course, is a cheat, a little bit of a cheat, but a good, honest, conscientious cheat, where the late Mr. Percy Hines and his son Patrick decided that the building was in such bad shape that they would in fact demolish it and rebuild it. So they attempted to rebuild it to look exactly like the original building and to last another 200 years. Of course, there's a bit of rubbish in between, but it's quite a nice streetscape showing the essential features of a 2-story commercial street.
Well, a point of consideration is, of course, the adaptive reuse of the old buildings. From the streetscape of Cheapside to the John Bull Bar, the story of Joseph Nathaniel Goddard, the Caroline Lee potatoes, Professor Fraser regales us with some social history of Barbados.
This was originally, and in Frankie and my boyhood, this was, Frankie, you remember? The John Bull Bar. And there was a big sign of a great big fat John Bull right there with a British flag and so on. I think he was wearing the flag, that kind of thing. That was the symbol of John Bull. And it was the original site of J.N. Goddard's first shop. So we've stopped here so that you can see a real bit of history. And the question about the milk market. Joseph Nathaniel Goddard was from the poor white community of St. John, St. Joseph, and his initial occupation was what is called, or was called in Barbados, a cow chauffeur. What was a cow chauffeur?
Somebody who drove cows.
Somebody who drove cows, indeed. He was someone who would buy a cow from Frankie in St. Philip and walk him to Bridgetown where Frankie might have lived and sell him the cow. So he would make a profit perhaps on the purchase and the sale, and then on the delivery as well, you see, you know, like how you buy a fridge and you have to pay for delivery, okay? So J.N. Goddard began his life as a cow chauffeur, and he was very, very friendly with another gentleman, another good gentleman from that era called Frederick Fitzherbert Cornelius Gill, FFC Gill. And Frederick Fitzherbert Gill was good friends with Joseph Nathaniel Goddard, two buddies growing up together, self-made men from rags to riches. But FFC Gill made his money a little bit earlier, and thereby hangs another tale, but we'll never get through if we tell you all these side stories, you see. So FFC Gill lent Joseph Nathaniel Goddard the money to open his first shop here. And according to Richard Goddard, the family lore in the Goddard family was that FFC Gill was the first customer. He walked into the shop the morning the shop opened, and he bought a demijohn of rum, a gallon of rum, and a pound of saltfish. So that's the history of this shop. The other thing about Joseph Nathaniel Goddard that people don't generally know is that he was such a hero that everybody named their boy child Joseph Nathaniel Goddard in the 1920s. When I was an intern in 1969, there were just an awful lot of people around 70 and 80 years old, especially from the north of Ireland, who knew Joseph Nathaniel Goddard and were named after him. The other point about stopping here is that blue building over there. What's that building? Harrison No. 1 at Broad Street. On that site was a hotel run by a lady who gave her name to a sweet potato in Barbados. Anyone? Any guesses?
Caroline.
The Caroline Lee potato, the beautiful yellow potato, the color of your shirt, right? More or less. Caroline Lee was a beautiful lady of mixed race, and people thought the potato color was similar to her color, so they called it the Caroline Lee potato. And there's a connection in my family because my great-grandfather's sister was married to a Mr. Barrow. Now, Lisa asked me whether I could say something about members of the Chamber of Commerce which would be relevant on the tour. I believe it was the same Mr. Barrow who was mentioned in the history of the Chamber of Commerce that I was reading, that I was given, this incomplete history. There was a significant Mr. Barrow in the middle of the 19th century. Well, this Mr. Barrow was married to the sister of my great-grandfather. And he left the home, the matrimonial home, the place of matrimonial bliss, and repaired to No. 1 Broad Street, where he shacked up with Miss Caroline Lee. And this, of course, in those days was not an appropriate thing to do, not kosher. And so my great-grandfather declared that Caroline Lee potatoes, those potatoes, will never be eaten in that house again. The lady's name must never be called.
But certainly our heritage will always be called. In fact, as of June 25th, 2011, the same day on which Professor Henry Fraser celebrated his birthday, it was no longer the heritage of Barbados merely. In fact, it became the heritage of the world. And so we end this, the first walk-in tour of historic Bridgetown. Please do join us again next time when the tour commences at a former educational institution which was dignified by the founder of Methodism. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Thank you for staying with me.